How about now? Can you hear me? I didn't have the sound turned on. Sorry. Can you hear me now? All right, sorry. I had the microphone turned off. What I said was I'm letting it stream for just a couple seconds. I am trying a new program that I'm hoping will help with the streaming of things, will make things a little bit smoother maybe. This is all new, so bear with me a little bit tonight. If it does at some point, I've got the chat opened up still, so if at some point it does all of a sudden start cutting out and you can't hear me or anything, or things are getting really bad, let me know so that I can try and fix things. I'd rather have a break in things and things not go, and you got let me talk the whole time, than try and just keep going with it and then everybody gets half the message, or everybody's not getting enough to where it does any good. So if things get really rough or things don't work right, just send a chat or even send me a text, and we'll try and get things resolved. Like I said, I don't want to get to the end of the message and then find out that nobody got it or everybody just got half of it. So as I had the little message thing going at the beginning for some of you that probably saw it. We will be having a Zoom meeting afterwards, so anybody's welcome to join in on that, and everyone's welcome to join in on that and to visit with us. I've got a couple texts from people having problems, so just bear with me for a second. Just wanting to make sure everyone gets on. Just bear with me. But it looks like we're probably going to be continuing with this kind of setup for at least a few more weeks. So my intention is to try and work on some new things, maybe make this work a little bit smoother, maybe give a little bit more professional work with it, instead of just getting on and hit and play. I don't know, I kind of like to mess with things to try and be a little bit more efficient and do a little bit better. But also, I did put on this is just another announcement. I did put on the Facebook page, but for anybody that still wants to give during this time, just mail it to the church, and we'll gather everything up there. So if you're still wanting to, for our members and anyone else as well, if you want to give, just mail it to the church. If you need the address, just let me know later on, and I can text that to you. So I'm just going to give a couple more minutes for anybody having a little bit of trouble getting on. But I think everyone's here. We've got our normal amount of people. So if you want to go ahead and turn to the passage, we're going to be in 1 Timothy chapter 5 tonight. And just a second. Alrighty. I still got a couple people are having some trouble, but I'll go ahead and get us started with at least a little bit of an introduction. But we're going to be in 1 Timothy chapter 5 tonight. And we're going to just be going through the first 16 verses tonight. And the first two verses are kind of separate from the rest, but we're going to look at them as well because it's just we're not going to divide it into a message by itself because there's not a whole lot there. But the main gist or the main part of what we're going to be talking about today is the church concerning widows and how to do those. This is one of the biggest things that people talk about a church doing and going through, or that a church needs to do, is to take care of the poor and the needy, which falls under that is the widows and orphans. And tonight, what we're going to be looking at specifically is the widows and taking care of them and helping them. But Paul gives, in writing to Timothy, he gives him some qualifications that for widows to be taken care of and to be helped by the church. It's not just any widow that can be taken care of. There are certain steps that need to be taken place. There are certain characteristics that the widows need to have in order to be taken care of. And there are two things about this. And one of the things we see is that we don't want to overwhelm the church with things that need to be done. We don't need to overwhelm them to the point that they can't take care of any. And then also, you don't want to be giving help to those that don't really need it, or those that we shouldn't be helping even. And so he talks about a lot of different things within this. And I've titled the message "Widows Indeed," because it's only the widows indeed, the widows that are indeed widows, that we need to be helping. And it's also wise for widows to be taking on the right characteristics and to be in the right position to be taken out. There is a responsibility on the part of the widows as well. And so we're going to be looking at that. And I want to go ahead and read our text. And we're going to read the text, and then we'll have a word of prayer. So he says in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 1, he says, "Rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father, and the younger men as brethren, the elder women as mothers, and the younger as sisters, with all purity. Honor widows that are widows indeed, but if any widow have children or nephews, let them learn first to show piety at home, and to requite their parents, for that is good and acceptable before God. Now she that is a widow indeed and desolate trusteth in God, and continueth in supplication and prayers night and day. But she that liveth in pleasure is dead while she liveth. And these things give in charge, that they may be blameless. But if any provide not for his own, and especially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith, and is worse than an infidel. Let not a widow be taken into number under 80 years old, having been the wife of one man, well reported of for good works, if she have brought up children, if she have lodged strangers, if she have washed the saints' feet, if she have relieved the afflicted, if she have diligently followed every good work. But the younger widows refuse, for when they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry, having damnation because they have cast off their first faith. And withal they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, not only idle, but tattlers also and busybodies, speaking things which they ought not. I will therefore that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, and give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully. For some are already turned aside after Satan. If any man or woman that believeth hath widows, let them relieve them, and let not the church be charged, that it may relieve them that are widows indeed." Let's go ahead and pray. Lord, I thank you for this day that you've given to us. I ask that you would continue to guide us and help us as we are going through this unique time to our generation, and just new things that we are experiencing and dealing with. I pray you continue to give wisdom to our leaders and those that are in the medical fields that are helping with everything that's going on. that you give them wisdom and direction, and that they can be effective in serving their communities across the world. I pray that you would help us during this time to grow closer to you and to focus on you more, Lord. I'd ask that you would just be with us right now, though, as we are studying your word. Please give us understanding of it. Help it to take seed in our hearts, and that we can learn and we can grow from it, Lord. And I'd ask that you would just guide me and direct me as I teach it, and that ultimately everything would be for your honor, your glory, and your will. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So as I said, the first couple verses have a couple of talk a little bit differently. They do kind of go with the widows, but at the same time, it goes with everything. Okay, so he tells Timothy, and Timothy, as a young pastor, he's in a place of leadership. He was in a place that was where he would be having to deal with people and to address things. And so he tells Timothy, he says, rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father. This word rebuke means to basically brings the idea of striking with words. So very hurtful words, very hard words, very arrogant words. It's just very abusive in your speech. And this is something that is very tempting for anybody, especially those in places of leadership and those in places of interacting and trying to lead people. He tells them, do not strike them with words. Don't hurt them with your words. Don't hit them hard with it. He says, but entreat him as a father. And treat him as a father. He is to encourage, he is supposed to strengthen, he is to respect them. Just as you would, in the proper way that you would answer to your parents. And he talks about the elder women as mothers. We have the command in Scripture to honor thy father and thy mother. You respect them, you listen, and you do not and try to run over them. You do not try to hurt them, but you listen respectfully. Even when later on as an adult, there are times where you can disagree with your parents, you still respect and you honor them. And this is the same way that he's telling Timothy to respond to elder men. And this word entreat even brings the idea of strengthening. So he's telling them, strengthen them, build them up. Many times when we strike people with our words, our intention is not to build them up. Our intention is to drag them down, to tear them down. And so he's telling them to strengthen them, encourage them. And he says, in the younger men as brethren. You take them as an older brother does with the younger brother when acting in the proper way. You take them under your wing. You still are strengthening them. You are still lifting them up. You're trying to help them to overcome maybe some mistakes that you have made. And then also to grow and to be stronger as well. And he says, and then he goes in verse 2, he says, in the young elder women as mothers. The way that you respond to your mother is one that is very soft, and you're trying to help them. You definitely do not try and run over your mother. You do not try to tear her apart, but you are very soft-spoken. You're very aware of how what you're saying affects her. And then he continues and he says, and the younger as sisters with all purity. The way that I respond to my sisters is one of caring, one of protecting oftentimes. My desire is for them to be at the very best. And so he tells them, he tells Timothy to treat them with all purity, to treat them in a way that is pure, that is good. And basically, the whole idea of all of this is that you are treating them in a caring way. You're not running over them. You're not trying to hurt them. And this is important in any type of leadership position. Timothy is a pastor of a church, is specifically what Paul is talking about. But this works on any level, in any interaction, even when you're not in places of leadership. It's still important to, to not treat them harmfully, to not hurt them, but to encourage and to strengthen them and to work to see the very best with them. Now, as he continues into verse 3, he says, honor widows that are widows indeed. Now he's going into the topic that we're really going to be dealing with tonight, which is widows indeed. Honor, and when he says honor widows, through the context of this, we know that he's talking about the church taking care of the widows. This does not mean that if a widow is not a widow indeed, which we're going to see what that phrase means, widow indeed. This does not mean that if they are not a widow indeed, that you don't need to be respectful to them, that you don't need to care about them, that you don't need to be nice to them, because just in the previous verse, he's talking about elder women and younger women as well, because there can be both young and old widows. You're still supposed to care for them and to help them, to be nice to them, encouraging to them. So he's not talking about, you can just do whatever you want to the widows that aren't widows indeed. What he's talking about is caring for the widows in the context of the church. And so he says, honor the widows that are widows indeed, and we're going to talk about that. But he says in verse 4, but if any widow have children or nephews, let them learn first to show piety at home and to requite their parents, for that is good and acceptable before God. Here's a first characteristic that he gives for the church taking care of widows. And he says that the very first thing is that the widows need to be taken care of by their family first. That their family is supposed to care for them and to help them. And he says here that the children or nephews, and I want to notice he says, let them learn first to show piety at home. What he says is, first and foremost, for each person individually, and he's talking about the children and nephews, the first and foremost responsibility they have is to the widows in their own family first, whether they're parents or their aunt, in this context. And so the first thing is to be first taking care of your family. And we see this with the pastors and the deacons as well, that their responsibility is to first take care of their families first. And if they cannot take care of their families, then they cannot take care of the things of the church. And so they need to be concerned with their families. And so he's telling them that the children and nephews of the mother, they need to take care of this. So we notice here, he says the children or nephews, which means this also falls even to son-in-laws to take care of it. Because he says the children. So a daughter who has a husband, or even the daughter, if able, is supposed to help take care of the mother as well. It's not exempt just because they're not blood, and you're not also exempt just because it's not your mother, because he says the nephews as well. So if there is a widow in your family, you shouldn't be working within the church and helping the church do things, but you first and foremost need to be checking to see and make sure you're doing everything that is needed for the widows in your family. And I want us to notice he also says to learn first to show piety at home. So even if it is not something that you are comfortable with, or something that you have done, or even something maybe that is hard to do, you need to figure out how to do it. You need to do it. Even if it's not something that comes naturally, say even you have other siblings that do it, you also still need to figure out how to do it yourself and to pitch in any way that you can. There is a command to do it. There is no excuse. There is no exemption of it. If there is a need that a widow in your family has, you need to take care of it. You need to help with it as much as you possibly can. Because he says that for this is good and acceptable before God. And he's going to talk a little bit more about this here, but I want us to notice right now just simply saying that this is good. This is what the God expects of you. This is what God wants of you. If you are not doing this, you are not walking in God's will. You're walking outside of it. Now in verse 5 he says, Now she that is a widow indeed and desolate trusteth in God and continueth in supplication and prayers night and day. What he says here is that a widow indeed is desolate. She does not have any other option. This word desolate means alone, with the idea of sadness as well. She is this widow, a widow that is a widow indeed, is completely alone. She does not have anybody with her. She's not just only without a husband, but she is without family that is able to help her as well. And so she is, this is one thing, but we also notice that it says she trusteth in God and continueth in supplication and prayers night and day. Another characteristic of a widow indeed is one that is trusting in the Lord, that is listening to the Lord, is allowing him to work. And this brings two ideas. One, she has a relationship with the Lord. She is not only just saved, just a believer, but she is actively building her relationship with God. She is actually actively growing in that relationship and not just coasting through or having no desire to even trust in the Lord or even build that relationship. And we see this because it also says that she continueth in supplications and prayers night and day. So she is constantly in this relationship with the Lord, constantly seeking him and reaching him. And another idea that this brings as well, and we see this, is that she is needing to trust in the Lord. So she is one that is actually in need of help. This is why she's truly spending a lot of time really trusting the Lord in this, because she has no other option. She has no other way to provide for her needs. She is just simply relying on the Lord to provide for her needs. And that is one that is truly a widow indeed. She wants to trust in the Lord, and she has to trust in the Lord because that's the only one that can help her. And of course, every way that we provide for our needs, whether we have income or not, is all from a blessing of the Lord. But those that do not have a source of income or are very stretched in their income, typically are much better and much more willing, kind of out of necessity and out of learning, to trust in God and to really ask for him to help. Many times when we are comfortable and everything seems to go going smoothly, we don't really ask the Lord to help us with it as much. We don't really request of it as much. But he says in verse 6, but she that liveth in pleasure is dead while she liveth. We see here a widow that is not a widow indeed. And it's talking, he says, but she that liveth in pleasure. And this brings the idea of one that is living in the world, is just wanting to live things up, and is not trusting in God, is not following God, is just living in whatever her fleshly desires want. And sometimes these people that are doing this can be those that are very well off. But that's not what he's talking about here. He's talking about one that is living their life improperly. And there are those that are very poor that do not have a lot of incomes that live their life in a very fleshly way, in a way that is about just fulfilling their physical desires or their sinful desires. And those people, many times, they will be blowing all of their income, what little they have, to live that up, and then they will expect others to pick up the slack and to help them with that. And what Paul is telling them is one that is doing this, that's living their life, is not one that is worthy of the church's help. It's not one that we should be helping. It even says that she that liveth in pleasure is dead while she liveth. She has no relationship with the Lord. She's living as if she is spiritually dead, and whenever they live as if they're spiritually dead, unless they just started with it, it's a sign that they are spiritually dead. And so Paul, he's saying that these people that live this way, they are not seeking God. They're not spiritually alive. They are dead. And, even though they may be alive and breathing inwardly, there's nothing there. They're just gone. And so he says in verse 7, and these things give in charge that they may be blameless. So he tells Timothy, tell them these things, make them aware of these things, so that they know where they need to be looking, the way they need to be acting. And he's going to talk about some more things to go with this. And this is what he's specifically talking about is these others, that these are what the widows need to be doing, or what their life should be in order to receive the help, and some wise things that they should be doing to keep from getting into trouble. And so he says in verse 8, but if any provide not for his own, and especially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. And so he says, anyone that does not provide for his own. Now, we're going to talk about this in two ways. First is within the family themselves. We saw in verse 4 that talked about the children, the nephews, needing to take care of the widows first, that it first falls to the family to take care of them. So in that context, a family member that refuses to take care of another, and we're talking about this in the context of widows, but I think this can, I believe that this can transfer into anybody that is in need within our family. That if we do not help them, if we do not provide for them as we should, those that truly need the help, and that are, he says that if we do not do that, especially those that are in our own house, or those that we are the closest to, or supposed to be the closest to, he says we have denied the faith. If we refuse to help them, we are denying our faith. We are denying the life that we are supposed to be living. We are denying the Lord. We may say that we are Christians. We may say that we are living for the Lord. But if we are denying the help to people, if we are not helping them, he says we are worse than an infidel. We're worse than a lost person. We think of lost people as being pretty bad. We may look at a murderer or a pedophile or even a homosexual and think of them as being in pretty horrible sins, and that making them as a horrible person. And that's not the way our attitude should be. We should never see a lost person as a horrible person that is beyond help, because everybody's helpable and everybody can be saved. Everyone can be forgiven of their sins and go into a relationship with the Lord. But he says you are worse than somebody that is lost. And here's the reason: because we are supposed to be better. We are held to a higher standard. As a saved person, you are held to a higher standard. There are things that you are supposed to be doing because God is within you. And so you need to take this very seriously. You need to be helping those within your family. And then also in the context of a church, we need to be taking care of those within our church. Many churches are very well versed in things outside of their church and wanting to do things outside. But if there are needs within the church itself, those need to be taken care of first. It does not exempt us from doing things outside the church, from going out, because Great Commission tells us to go. It doesn't tell us to stay within our group. It tells us to go out. And so we need to be, though, taking care of those that are within us. It is a sad thing when churches do not take care of their own. And it is a sad thing as well whenever those within a family unit do not take care of those within their family. When those within their family have to turn to other places to get help because their children or their nieces and nephews want nothing to do with them. It's not something that should be taking place for a believer to be ignoring those. And then he says in verse 9, he gives us a list of requirements for a woman to receive help. He says, let not a widow be taken into the number under threescore years old. So the first thing he tells us is that one then is put on the help of the church. You should not help those that are under threescore years old, which is 60 years. Those that are younger, we should not be helping them. And we're going to leave this one because a little bit later he talks about why it's better to not help them. Okay, he's not saying, because they're under 60, that means we just leave them on the streets. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that it is better for them to do something different than to live off of the church or to want the church to help. So we'll come back to that one. So they need to be at least 60. And now he continues in verse 9. He says, having been the wife of one man. So we talked about this when we were talking about the pastor and the deacon. We said that they need to be the husband of one wife, or they need to be a one-woman man. Well, in this case, the widow needs to have been a one-man woman. She was dedicated to only one husband at a time. So she was married to one, and then we see the characteristics for legitimate divorce is there is no divorce, there's only death. So, she could have had more than one husband, but they both better have passed through, the first one should have passed through death before the next one. But she was committed to only one. She is not an adulteress. She did not go all over the place. She's committed to just one. And then it says, and well reported of for good works. So the next thing is she needed to have a lot of good works. It means she has been active in serving God and doing the things of the Lord. She does the good works. She's not somebody that's just meandering around and not doing anything. And she's working for the Lord. She's doing a lot of good things. And it is well reported. It's not something that you got to go digging for and you got to try and make up. It's something that everyone thinks, oh yeah, she does all of this for the Lord. She's done all of these things. She is a woman that works hard for the Lord. And then it says, if she have brought up children, so she has raised the children that she has well. She's raised them up in the Lord. She has done everything that she was supposed to do as a mother. Then it says, if she hath lodged strangers, so she is hospitable. She is willing to serve those that come in and need help. We see this happening with Abraham when he had angels that came in and they lodged them. We see that it's very important for people to be hospitable, to help people. And he says that she has washed the saints' feet. This brings the idea that she is willing to serve those and to do anything to serve them, even if it is washing the feet. This washing of the feet does not mean literally she washed their feet, even though she could have washed their feet, but it brings the idea of service. We see that Christ washed the feet of the disciples, and it was about showing his service to them, his service, showing his humbleness. And this is what he is talking about, is she is humble and she is willing to serve any that need it in any way that she can. Even if they don't need it, she wants to serve them. And she says, and if she has relieved the afflicted, or she has helped those herself that were afflicted and are in need. And we see if she has diligently followed every good work. So what we're seeing in this is the characteristics of a woman that is very much so in service to God and has been. She wants to serve God. She uses her life for the Lord. And she does everything she possibly can to walk as she could, as she should. And, for a church to be helping a woman, she needs to be serving the Lord. She can't be someone that is causing problems, someone that is not doing anything. Now, it's different if she is unable to go and to do anything. There's a certain point where people get to a place physically they can't go out and do things. But there are still women that even physically are unable to do things. They still encourage people. They still help people with their words and with their caring heart. But she is one that is doing things for the Lord. She has a very strong relationship with God. So she, in a way, earns the help of the church. Now, I'm not saying that there needs to be we've paid you $100, so we need to see if you've done $100 worth of work. That's not the way it's supposed to work. But she is working for God. Now, verse 11, he's going to explain why the younger widows, we need to not help them, why it's not a good idea. He says in verse 11, but the younger widows refuse. For when they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry, having damnation because they have cast off their first faith. And withal they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but tattlers also, and busybodies, speaking things which they not ought. I will therefore that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully. For some are already turned aside after Satan. So he gives us a few verses here as to why we need to encourage the younger widows to go a different direction. Because the first thing he says is back up in verse 11. He says, for when they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry. What this brings is, it says, this wax wanton brings the idea basically sexual desires, and I want us to look at this in what will happen here is, and we see this in verse 12. He says, having damnation because they have cast off their first faith. So what has happened here is he's saying that these widows, they become widows, they get on the help of the church, and because they have the help, what happens is they become idle. And younger widows, they will still have physical desires that are designed by God, but because of those things, they're going to want to marry again. They're going to get to the point where they want to be married. And what will happen is they're going to go with that. And he says they're having damnation because they have cast off their first faith. Basically, what is happening here, and he doesn't tell us exactly what commitments they were making, but what he's talking about is that they were making commitments to be a widow and to only serve Christ. They're making this commitment, but because of their physical desires, they end up getting married again. They go back on the commitment they made, or the word they made, and they cause an against. And for information about this, in James chapter 5 and verse 12, it says, "But above all things, my brethren, swear not, neither by heaven, neither by earth, neither by any other oath, but let your yea be yea, and your nay be nay, lest ye fall into condemnation." And Christ talked about it in Matthew as well, that we need to be very aware and to make sure that what we say, we're going to be able to hold to it. And that we should not swear, we should not make promises, because if we don't keep them, then we've fallen on an oath that we've made. And then our oaths need to be, everything that we say needs to the best of our ability, come true. And what Paul is saying here, he's saying the younger women, he's not saying this is a horrible thing that they have these desires. What he's saying is because there's desires, the chances are very high that they're going to want to remarry again, especially the younger that they are. And so he tells them, do not encourage them instead, and we're going to see this, or let's go ahead or look in verse 14. He says, "I will therefore that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully." So what he says is, it is better for them to go and to get married and to serve the Lord as a married woman than to be a widow, to say she's going to stay that way, and then later on change her mind. Just go ahead and go into that. Don't try and just not do it just to hold an oath or just to say something, because then you're going back for it. And he gives more information as well as to why we need to why the younger widows need to just remarry, or they need to just work to provide for themselves. Because in verse 13, he says, "And withal they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, not only idle, but tattlers also, and busybodies, speaking things which they ought not." He says, so they need to be either serving as a married woman, or they need to be trying to provide for themselves, because we don't want them to be idle. Rarely do people just stay idle, especially younger people with more energy and ability to get up and go places a lot more, and the desire to get up and go and do things more. They're not going to just stay idle. They're going to find something to fill their time with. And what Paul says is that when people get idle, what happens is they do things that they shouldn't be doing. He describes them here as wandering about from house to house. They're just going from house to house, and they're not idle, but they're tattlers and busybodies, and they're speaking things out to. So what happens is they're just going about causing problems. They're bugging people. They're gossiping. They are saying things about people. They're filling their time with talking and spreading rumors and just snooping in people's lives. And this is not something that's supposed to be taking place within a church. But this is what's going to happen whenever they don't have something to fill their time. And if a church is providing for them to where they don't have to go and provide for themselves, then or they are not seeking to get married and to fulfill as just a mother, or they're just not finding something to fill their time, they're going to cause problems. They're going to do this. And so he says it is better for them, at the very least, to be married and to have children and to guide the house, to raise the house. And these things where it talks about the younger women marry, and then he talks about them bearing children and guiding the house. These are things that are very good for a woman to be doing. These are things that are very honoring to the Lord and are very important to the Lord. And so basically what he's saying is, instead of being a widow and being bored and causing problems, get married again have children, and serve God as a married person. Instead of trying to stay a widow and causing all of these problems, going back on your word maybe. And he says here in verse 15, for some are already turned aside after Satan. He says, and some have already fallen into this trap. Some have already done this. And so what Paul is talking about here is not in theory. This is stuff that is already taking place. Whether it was taking place in Timothy's area or taking place in other churches that Paul had been to, he says this is some that some people have already done. And I think if we think about it, we can think about maybe some women that are very idle and bored that have gotten into a lot of problems because they didn't have anything to do. And so it's important that the church not give them the ability to be idle if they can go and still provide for themselves, still do things. And I want us to notice that in all of this, he does not ever say, let them go out on the streets and have nothing. What he's talking about is them being provided for through other means. So with the younger widows, they get married again, or they can even go and work. Of course, the working would have been a little bit harder in Paul's time, but it's very much so very easily done today. But at the very least, he says they can get married and work through that. And so there's this idea that there needs to be other things that are looked at first that are probably even better for them and will put them in a better place to serve the Lord better. And then he finishes it off here. He says, if any man or woman that believeth have widows, let them relieve them, and let not the church be charged, that it may relieve them that are widows indeed. And so Paul, he tells Timothy, if there's anybody that has a widow in their family, they need to take care of them first and foremost. It is not for the place for anybody to just bum a widow off on the church. The family needs to take care of them first. Because here's the reason. The church needs, if somebody else can take care of them, then that allows the church to focus on people that actually need the help. And people should not be, and then this goes with anything, we should not be taking advantage of the help of the church. Because there are going to be those that need help, and whenever we go and take advantage of that, the church may not be able to help those people. And so it needs to be those that really, truly need the help. And a person should not be allowing that to go on and to use up church resources whenever they can be taking care of it. As we saw earlier, this is very... this is something that the Lord is very unhappy with whenever believers allow those in need, not just widows, but anyone that is in need to go without help whenever we have that ability, when we should be taking care of our own. And so as we look at these things, we've seen things that the widows indeed need to be taken care of and need to be doing. And we also seen things that the church needs to be doing and people within the church need to be doing and how this works. So let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. One thing I will mention again, there will be a Zoom chat that'll take place as soon as I get off of here and get on to that. So if you'd like to join us, let me know. And I didn't post a link on Facebook. I think the old links will work for it, but I can also send you a ID number that if you type that in, it'll take you to it. So let's go ahead and have a word of prayer, then we'll get off of here. Lord, I thank you for this day that you've given to us. I thank you for your word and what it teaches us and the wisdom it imparts on to us, Lord. I pray that you would help us to always be serving you as we should, to not be idle, to be allowing ourselves to get into trouble, and to also be taking care of those within our family, whether they be widows or others, and to help them in any way that we can, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.